So it's been a long morning, and here I am. I'll try and keep it lively and brisk if I can have my slides. That'd be great. And I'll make sure I can work this. I will just say, obviously, a huge thanks to Peter for being involved. It's been a privilege to be at this conference and also actually another meeting which had a similarity in being an informal gathering of people in the world of top-level science agency. In the case of the Global Research Council, which is the informal, if you like, gathering of funding agencies that happens every year. It's not all the funding agencies, but nevertheless, it's a powerful group of people. They're not necessarily connected into the same policy orientation that you are. My talk actually is about, I think, the influence that the chief scientific advisors might want to have back into the scientific community. We've heard a lot today and yesterday about advice, about engagement with people outside the scientific community, and that actually is an important part of what I'm talking about. But as far as the context of this meeting is concerned, I would hope that it might stimulate people to just think, they already are thinking, but in some particular ways, about what's going on when you're trying to make science useful, but above all, you're trying to motivate the scientific community to think about being useful. So I'm making the hypothesis that if you increase the prestige of, quote, useful research, you're going to be doing some good for the changing social contract, as it's been called. And now here I have my learning exercise to do because I haven't actually looked at what it, okay, thank you. So I'll talk about science's changing social contract very briefly. I'll address 3 societal challenges. I'll focus on some common issues, talking about measuring the impact, how you might acquire prestige from that, and then how you might nudge the social contract in turn. I do have 2 health warnings. I'm sharing very early thinking about this myself. So I'm the editor-in-chief of Nature, but I'm also the editor-in-chief of our company. And the company recently merged the natural, the social sciences, and the humanities in its publishing activities. So I'm thinking nowadays as much about some of the big societal challenges which bring together those disciplines. And this is my way of getting into that from an editor's perspective. I'm not an expert in the research that I'm going to discuss, some of which is controversial, I think. I'm making no judgment about the quality of what I'm relaying here, which has come out of conversations I've been having. Rather, I'm looking at what I can see in recurrent patterns in and around this type of research. So I haven't quite learned what I did to get it. Okay. A quick challenge, if you like, that was given to the community by Jane Lubchenco, who many of you may know, when she was the AAAS president in 1997. So that's quite a long time ago. Urgent and unprecedented environmental and social changes challenge scientists to define a new social contract. This contract represents a commitment on the part of all scientists to devote their energies and talents to the most pressing problems of the day in proportion to their importance in exchange for public funding. The new and unmet needs of society include more comprehensive information, understanding, technologies to move towards a more sustainable biosphere, one which is ecologically sound, economically feasible, and socially just. New research, faster and more effective transmission of new and existing knowledge to the policy and decision makers, better communication will all be required. So since that statement was made, there's been an extraordinary transformation in our ability to communicate. There's been lots of research. There's been the open access movement in science. This talk isn't about the communication only. That's an important part. But how fares more generally this change in the social contract? In 2014, I will just mention as I did, the Global Research Council and this meeting, where one clear message that's been reiterated is a clear sense of pressure from governments to justify the spending on research. And in an editorial that we published in the first issue of the year, we highlighted a need for balanced assessment of research achievements in order to help drive this more balanced assessment of what the role of science is, and incidentally also research robustness, which I'm not going to go into here. I'm going to mention 3 societal challenges: research for mental health, research for healthcare delivery, and research for access to water. But before I do that, I do just want to make the point that fundamental science really is crucial. Don't by any means let anyone think that I'm suggesting otherwise. And I've just got 3 topics here that we published in Nature at one time or another. Transitions from the Neanderthals to modern humans in Europe, magneto-optical trapping of 300 diatomic molecules at 2.5 millikelvin a first, and the detection of exoplanets, which of course potentially may have a huge cultural impact on humanity. but came out of just fundamental research. These are all incredibly important. The standards of prestige that come out of such publications is, in some senses, questionable at times, the extent to which it's dependent on the glamour journals that people call us. But nevertheless, we all understand what the prestige for that sort of work is. The prestige for this other sort of work isn't so clear to me. So research for mental health, healthcare delivery, research for access to water. I'm not even going to read the rest of that slide. It was just me justifying my interest in the topic, but it's quite clear from this meeting that I don't need to do that. So research for mental health. The burden of psychiatric disorders is absolutely huge. I'm going to take that as read. I'm not going to give you all the statistics, but it's much, much bigger than many other diseases which get a lot of funding. I'm a founding trustee of a research funding charity, MQ, Transforming Mental Health. That's funded out of an initiative of the Wellcome Trust, and Mark can take a lot of credit for this, where they gave us, the trustees, a 20 million donation to set up a fundraising body, exploiting above all the charitable framework of the UK, but also international in its scope, to try and support in a sustainable way in the long term research into that. Nature frequently publishes the basic neuroscience and genetics and genomics of these. That's what you'll find everywhere. But the actual, what about the rest of what's needed in mental health research? So there is all that wonderful neuroscience and genetics happening, intrinsically important, hopefully eventually making understanding, prevention and treatments much more robust, but that's a multi-decade timescale. The pharmaceutical industry has substantially retreated from this sector for understandable reasons given the biological challenges. It remains an engine for the development of therapies and has a big influence on national science policy. But there are other effective treatments. There is no such engine as a pharmaceutical industry for psychological therapies, for talking treatments. Yet many have been well validated in randomized clinical trials. Investment in research and delivery can make a substantive difference in the daily lives of sufferers for those conditions that I've listed there, depression, anxiety, OCD. And research that you put into that can really make a difference to people within 5 to 10 years. These successes need to be made much more visible, more available, and more prestige-winning than they are. There is another factor, of course, that within research and within healthcare, mental health has a stigma, quite apart from the stigma it has in wider society. Research for healthcare delivery. Over the last few months, I've had a few conversations with experts in the field of healthcare delivery research for HIV and AIDS. And that was a theme I focused on because it became clear that once the antiretroviral therapies had been developed, delivery became a really tractable issue. The challenge spans the developed and the developing worlds. The natural and the social sciences are equally important in achieving results. So some observations that came out of my conversations. Implementation research, dissemination research, impacts evaluation research, health systems research, they're all related, but you wouldn't necessarily think so if you go and talk to the practitioners. There's a lot of silos there. Eric Gooseby, who was Obama's global AIDS coordinator, talked about the dependence of multi-million-dollar decisions on some anthropological studies which related to the culture, exactly the challenge we were hearing about just now, related to the culture of the environments in which the treatments were going to be delivered. Another researcher, Aditya Kamanchi, who works at UCSF on TB, studied 6 TB centers in Uganda. There were particular treatments that he was wanting to apply. They didn't seem to be delivering, and it was only when he went and talked to 46 individuals around the 6 centers in Uganda that he began to understand why that was. And the message that came through in these conversations is that qualitative anthropology really matters, and you need to put that together with clinical and medical thinking. The publishing of qualitative research is problematic, as is its value recognition by other disciplines. So you don't have the numbers, you don't have the hypothesis you can just easily relate to what you're hearing. You're hearing these narratives, and a lot of people find that difficult to recognize as good research, and publishers don't often do justice to it. Researchers, now this is an important point from my point of view, researchers in healthcare implementation publish papers, they write up the practical results and something of the impacts for their funders, after which it all vanishes. So there is of course a research literature, but the actual practical implications, the protocols, etc., a lot of that goes invisible. It just isn't being exposed. And if you look at the funding, only about 5% of the funding is being spent on looking into dissemination of results. So where is the value as seen by the others? What prestige does this sort of research, which will not appear in the glamour journals, and how can it acquire the prestige that it deserves? And then the third topic, research for access to water. Conversations at Monash University's Centre for Water Sensitive Cities, conversations with California academics and state agencies about the Californian drought. We publish in this area, though we don't really focus on these sorts of issues. Now, I've taken some slides from Rebecca Brown, who's head of the Centre for Water Sensitive Cities at Monash. I'm not assessing the quality of this research, I'm just reflecting on its characterization of the ways forward. I have talked to the California, but the California situation, I was at the Department of Water Resources only 2 weeks ago. So they have this extraordinary challenge, which is just worth mentioning as a comparison to something that is rather more capturable, I think, in the case of Melbourne University, Melbourne and Monash University, as they try to help each other. In California, you have this Department of Water Resources with a massive set in the state of agencies, 200 different agencies delivering water, huge numbers of communities and counties, several basins, all of that, and they can only really deal with the drought, which is looking increasingly drastic, by trying to incentivize people. They have no state power, as it were, to insist. And of course, those incentives can be economic and so on, which is why you need some of the academic disciplines in that sense, as well as the technology senses. However, what I liked about what I saw at the centre at Monash was just the characterization of their challenge. So there was this research journey that they went through, where from the 1990s through to where they are now, they increased their involvement of disciplines. Now, it happens that Rebecca Brown is both an engineer and a sociologist by training, but by this time, she now has this sort of set of discipline, and she can talk, I think, very interestingly about the way in which those disciplines work together. So that's just my emphasis of that. She pictures water developing cities, as it were, in this left to right transition from something that is just basically dependent on the supply that you can make right at the left through to what she hopes would lie in the future. And as you look across the top, you can see the various things that people need to be dealing with in order to get you to that next stage of sophistication, water recycling, water reclamation from storms, and so on. And also the issues that people need to think about in terms of their values and behaviors around water in order for that to happen. There are partners in this project. So if you go to California, you just see that about 10 times more numerous in terms of the people you're trying to involve. So that just gives you a sense of how difficult it is sometimes when you're talking about stakeholders to really resolve just exactly where the interests are and where the impacts are going to be. Sorry. This just gives a quick little, I'm not going to go through it in detail, about some of the social, societal impact issues that are in this research. So you've got the evaluation of the benefits at the far left. You've got to think about mapping the different sensitivities and the different cultural changes that are going to take place. You have to look at the governance. You have to look at behavior change. So that's all deeply embedded, as it were, in this sort of thinking, as well as the engineering, the systems changes, et cetera, the technologies you're going to use to help reclaim and recycle water. And then this is getting us towards the impacts question as you start from the bottom up to the top right, where you have the emergence of the issue, the definition, the shared understanding, the knowledge dissemination, policy and practice diffusion, and embedding new practices. So that is where the research is useful. So it's not necessarily fundamental in scientific terms. I mean, it is. There is innovation definitely in there within the, for example, the biochemistry of some of the reclamation techniques. But it is absolutely about impact. And again, a complicated slide. All that I'm showing you is that one can map in a way that may be applicable in other of these sorts of challenges in principle, how as you go across up that curve that I showed in the last slide, you get different types of people that you have to involve as stakeholders. You get different types of knowledge that you need. You have different types of projects, and you have different types of tools. So if you think about that in that sort of granular detail, you can begin to think about, well, where can we, as funders, as policymakers, as publishers, etc., engage with these processes to try and make them more visible, to try and make them more efficient, and so on. Just coming back to the impacts, if you have social research, it'll have an impact on policy, law, incentives, and capacity. You have physical research, you'll have proofs of concept, you'll have patents, codes of practice, and commercialization. And you'll have these issues you have to think about: role of access to trusted advisors, knowing your audience, additional packaging of jargon-free knowledge, all the things we've heard about already today, and understanding the strength or otherwise of the business case, because sometimes, of course, businesses are key allies in helping to deliver social change. So I asked the question, how can one disseminate or expose the processes and any generalizability of interactions between academia and cities or regions, and the impacts that their work has had or could have on those cities or regions? And these are the sort of things that are very rudimentary. It is the sharing of outputs, it is the sharing of slides, it is the Google searching for all the references to your work that you can find in government websites, and et cetera, et cetera. What about the networks of people doing similar jobs here, but also in the healthcare delivery research? The response is, it could be so much better than it is. It could be so much better in terms of databases of results that we could be sharing much more efficiently than we do. So there is an infrastructure case here in these different sectors of social challenges. So the general observations I make are, universities are increasingly focusing on these as multidisciplinary issues, but these are institutionally challenging. So I'm not even going to talk about all the incentives and disincentives within the university system. Social science is often mentioned, but is too often a poor relation. Framing the problem in a joined-up way is essential, and that takes time and money. Dissemination is underplayed. The grey literature matters a lot, but it is very diffuse, and there isn't a quality control, of course. The social value of academic work is difficult to capture in these sorts of contexts. And another thing I've noticed, and this has been true here actually in talking about these things to various ones of you, there's a lot of adverse comment about this sort of research. You'll sort of talk to people and they say, yeah, but it's pretty flaky, you know. And so you talk about that with psychological treatments. Yeah, but do they really work? You know, well, yes. And then this work that's being done at Monash, yeah, well, I sort of saw they applied that to Auckland and, you know, it looked very dodgy. And so the question is, is that because it is dodgy work, all the stuff I'm talking about, or is it because we just don't understand it properly, and that all the funders are really not funding the right sort of work? And I'm sure there are all sorts of answers to that sort of question, but it's just something I'm noticing, that when you get into this sort of research, you'll pick up a lot more adverse criticism, I suspect, because of the nature of the beast. So I'm getting towards the end, and you can get your lunch. So documenting impacts beyond academic citations. There is this UK research assessment, the Research Excellence Framework, I should say, happening right now, where panels are looking at the submissions from universities in the UK. And the controversial thing about that is how closely it links to the funding that those universities then receive. And then there are just proposals by a group at the London School of Economics that I just wanted to highlight. And these are just examples of how one measures, or people are thinking about measuring social impacts, societal impacts. So for the Research Excellence Framework, there is now a closed database, but it will be published in February next year, of 7,000 statements of research impact compiled by research groups making submissions. They're now being assessed by expert panels, and the results of the framework, the assessment itself, will be published in December. Each of those impact statements is worth just saying something quickly about that, because I don't think in principle this is an unreasonable thing to ask of a research group every 4 or 5 years. It is a 4-page statement, it is a summary, it has an underpinning research section, it has references to that research, but it details the impact itself in the form of uptake in national guidelines, dissemination, implementation, and then it provides sources for corroboration. And the examples that I could talk about are changes in international clinical practice in heart failure, spin-out companies in information technologies, physics educational software in schools coming out of antimatter at CERN experiments, changes in music training in foreign countries, architecture in conflict zones. So these are the sorts of things which are not at all necessarily expectable in research and well worth documenting in my view. And then there's this book that came out of the LSE, I think it was last year maybe, by Bastow et al. Patrick Dunleavy is the leader of the group. And that is just looking at various mechanisms. I just think is a nice practical manual, if you like, of how you might set about documenting impacts on government and impacts on civil society and impacts on the private sector of activities by the social sciences in particular. And I'm not going to describe it in detail. You can have a look at it. They've got a blog on impacts, and you can find some of these examples on a public website. So there's this hierarchy of retrospective evidence of impact. There's anecdote. there's narrative, and that's what I think those bits of evidence are about. There are narratives submitted by the academics about what they think they've achieved. There is an independent analysis, which can be a lot more challenging, and then there is a meta-analysis. So I think there will be something of an independent analysis when the Higher Education Funding Council of England publishes those 7,000 statements in February. I think it's going to be published with some sort of analysis, and then it's going to be open for academics to pore over. But ultimately, the impact has to be a consequence that is tangible and documentable beyond academia. Something must have happened. A company must have survived. Employees must have been employed, or whatever it is. And tracing that back to the academic research can be very challenging. But if we're serious about this business of a changing social contract, isn't it something we have to attempt? We should just mention that there are academic exports in the form of PhDs. So we need PhDs to permeate society to help address these challenges. I have a son who's doing a pure maths PhD at the moment at Edinburgh University, and I'm delighted by the fact that he doesn't want to go on and be a mathematician. So he wants to get out into society and probably make money or do something that's going to be useful to me. But anyway, then there is a mindset of academia against people moving out of academia, isn't there? I mean, isn't it just the case too often that academics don't want people to leave academia? They see that as a failure if that person leaves academia. That's changing, and I think we've had some discussion about that, but it is still too strong. And the most important thing, and this came out of a conversation I had with Peter and Mark Ferguson of Ireland, that tracking of PhD exports from academia, what happens to your students? Where do they go? And your graduates? It's very, very bad indeed. But Mark was telling me that Denmark is apparently very good at it, thanks to intra-government data sharing, which may get some people rather worried, but nevertheless, they apparently do it. And if that's true, I think there could be a model for people. Sorry, looks so granular. This is almost my last slide. So prestige. People do say, why don't you create a nature journal in X? So when I went to talk to the healthcare people, they said, why don't you do a nature journal? It'd be so wonderful. And yes, it's a possibility. One can always think about publishing and developing the framework of the Nature brand or other brands. But the way that is posed actually reflects this, I think, terrible overdependence on journal brands in people's thinking about what's worthwhile science. And what I've been trying to do here is to explore the landscape in which everyone else also needs to step up to a plate to give worthwhile research, useful research, some sort of a prestige. So explicit peer and stakeholder recognition and career award is what that should be about. If you want to give prestige, you need that recognition. You need to develop the thematic networks and qualitative impact databases to make these things visible. You need to make the networks generally more visible and accessible. You need to change the criteria for the national academies, perhaps to broaden in the sorts of utility that they might be willing to recognize, as well as pure academic excellence. You need to give explicit credit in research assessment, an idea that came out of my conversation with Mark on developing non-academic panels capable of validating the impact with totally different sorts of expertise, rather than academics trying to work out, well, was this impactful or not? Researchers and their institutions should communicate their impacts wherever they are recognized by others implicitly or explicitly. Governments should recognize policy impacts publicly unless it's going to embarrass somebody. It's true, some people don't want it to be known that they've influenced the government in this particular area. And then funds will be required to enable and drive these developments. It's an extension of the open access agenda as I see it. The open access agenda has been about scientific data, scientific publishing. In some areas it's a no-brainer. In climate change research, it seems to me, it absolutely should be free at the time of publication, etc. And I would love to see people stepping up with the funds to make that possible. But it applies to this too. If you're going to really try and make this stuff visible and gain prestige and communication, you're going to have to fund that access in some way. So, in summary, how to give useful research prestige, documentation, dissemination, uptake and recognition, and celebration in prestigious and or impactful contexts. These can incentivize the community to become more attuned within an evolving social contract, and anything you chief scientists can do to help that would be great. Thank you.